Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. And today we're in Edinburgh, we're at Bute House, the official residence of the First Minister of Scotland, and I'm delighted to say that we're joined by John Swinney. Mr. Swinney, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We want to look at the record of the government to date, the government that you lead, some of the issues in the run-up to 2026. So, Alec, you kick us off with the first question.
Thank you very much for being with us, First Minister.
Thank you.
2 years ago, you were out, and then, like Michael Corleone, they've dragged you back in and so on. Or if you like to mix Italian metaphors, you've become the Cincinnatus of the SNP, dragged back to save the party, to answer its call in its hour of desperate need. What did you learn about the government and the business of government in your year off? What did that year off period of contemplations on, did it allow you to rethink how the business of government might be organised, what the business of government should be, how the SNP should attempt to renew itself as it seeks a third decade in office after the next election?
That was a welcome opportunity for me to consider those issues, and actually I don't think I could have done the role had I not had that period off. So when I think back to March 2023, when Nicola Sturgeon stood down, and I did contemplate coming forward to become First Minister at that time, I didn't think it would work out for me, because I thought I was exhausted, and I had given all that I could at that particular moment. And I thought to then move in from being Deputy First Minister to First Minister, that I just didn't think I had the physical and mental energy to be able to do that. So the advantage of that year out, which I'm now elegantly calling my sabbatical year, I had that opportunity to recharge my batteries physically and mentally, and that did me a huge amount of good in that period. But it also allowed me to engage in some different, just to look at things from a different perspective, from a perspective I hadn't done for, it would be about 20 years, where I had been in frontline political activity. And one tangible example of that was I sat in that year on the Criminal Justice Committee in Parliament, and I took evidence with colleagues about the Victims and Witnesses Bill, which I had approved in Cabinet to come forward into the legislative programme. And I sat on the other side of the table and took evidence from a variety of different stakeholders, and I began to think, wait a minute, there's issues in this bill that need to be resolved. So there was the lesson I took from that experience was that you can endorse a proposal going through government, look at all the evidence and think that you've done the right thing, and put it into the legislative process of Parliament. And then you can look at it from a different perspective, as I did in committee, and say, wait a minute, there's issues in here. So the lesson it taught me is that you have to be prepared ever more to look at issues and questions from other people's perspectives and try to see what are the pitfalls in the ideas and the proposals that you may be bringing forward. So that's one observation I would make of that period. The second is that I think I got the impression that the government's agenda was incredibly broad and was trying to do an incredibly large number of things. And I could see that increasingly as political scrutiny came onto the government about different issues becoming difficult to sustain. So it wasn't the case that everything was able to be done well. It was just the government was trying to do so many things that inevitably it was using up too much bandwidth on particular questions. So I suppose the two lessons that I brought into government with me from my period outside of government were firstly that you really had to look at questions inside, outside, upside, downside to make sure you understood all of the possible implications. And secondly, that there was a need to focus the government on some really tangible, clear, a very tangible and clear agenda. So, I've set out a programme for government. I've now reinforced it with a budget, which is focused on 4 themes of eradicating child poverty, stimulating economic growth, making a just transition to net zero, and improving our public services, especially the National Health Service. And I suppose there's one other dimension that I brought to government, which is much longer lasting of my experience in government. And that is the need to get the whole of government activated around about your agenda. Mm-hmm. And to do that in a non-compartmentalised way. Now, I think there have been times during the SNP government where we've been really good at that, where we've been really good at taking that non-compartmentalised cross-government approach. And I think there have been times where we've been not so good at that. And I've been determined to restore that sense of non-compartmentalised working, which we're taking forward.
Let's stick in this theme about what you could almost call your philosophy of how you govern and how you take forward your political endgames. One of the key themes of this podcast that we both agree on, and we come back to time and time and time again, is that, the ideal situation for a First Minister is that a First Minister can say, the crisis in the health service is, we're on top of it, the waiting times are coming down, we've put in more money, the structures are delivering. In terms of economic growth, we're doing various bits in here with policy, and the structures are delivering. But of course, that's not the story at the moment. And let me put a point to you. I mean, it's almost a sort of philosophical point, that in the entire devolved period, we have had social democratic parties of the Labour Liberal variety, and now that the SNP. And it does strike me that one of the big issues, is that governments make resources available. The will to do things in terms of policy ends is there, it's clear, and politicians clearly explain what they are. But there is something that happens between the Cabinet taking a decision and Parliament agreeing resources to deliver certain political ends. And yet, when it goes through various institutions of the state, the policy end isn't realised because the attitude of politicians in the devolved era has been timid when it comes to not changing, not reforming organs of the state as a means of delivering policy ends.
I think I have some sympathy with the point, which is about the importance of delivery. And I'll come on to talk a little bit more about that, because part of what I've tried to bring into government since I came back in last May is an absolutely relentless focus on delivering good outcomes for people in Scotland. And I felt that was necessary because people had to feel, in a sense it's accepting your point, Bernard, people had to feel the impact of delivery in their lives. Now, if I give you a couple of examples about where I think we have been bold, if you take the expansion of early learning and childcare, now that was viewed, I was persuaded about the merits of expanding early learning and childcare by an economist who persuaded me of the economic value of what this would enable the country to get the benefit of by supporting families, by expanding the level of childcare. Now, we set that as an objective. We went about delivering that programme in consort with local authorities, and we delivered it in its entirety. We delivered it a year late, and my plea in mitigation was that we were trying to deliver it in August 2020, and the COVID pandemic struck us in March 2020. So I just, that's my explanation. But we got there in August 2021, and it's been hugely impactful in getting children off to the best start in life, but also about enabling individuals and families to make more of an economic contribution through becoming economically active. Now, that's one programme that has successfully gone from conceptual announcement by First Minister to implementation in every community in the country in, I think that must have been done over about maybe a 4-year period, I think, was from start to finish to get to that point, which on a comprehensive national programme I think is understandable. Particularly was a lot of new build activity required. Second big example is the reform of police and fire services in Scotland, where we had 8 police forces and 8 fire services in the country. And we took a decision to go from first ministerial statement, we will have single police and fire services, to making that happen. And that's happened. And I think that model is not only serving us well, but it's saved us public expenditure into the bargain. So there are examples where I would say I could address the point that you put to me, Bernard. But there has to be more of a sense amongst the public that government is delivering for them. So what I've brought into the shape of government now, and next Tuesday, for example, the Cabinet will meet with the senior civil service leadership to monitor the delivery of the government's programme, which is an interaction between the politicians and the civil servants, which has never historically happened, but I've brought that in so that we can essentially confront the issues of delivery, and everybody around the table knows the politicians want to deliver because we want to be able to explain to the public the impact we're making in their lives. And civil servants understand that politicians want to know that the programme is being delivered. And we now have lots of mechanisms that go on within government that give me much greater assurance about the progress that's been. Now, that's a reform that I've brought into government, which is designed to address exactly the point that you put to me, which I think is a completely fair point, Bernard, that the public need to feel and understand that commitments made in the rhetoric are turned out into the reality of what people experience.
Yeah, because many of these challenges are not unique to the SNP, they're not unique to Scotland, they're not even unique to other parts of the United Kingdom and so on, but there is nevertheless a sort of palpable feeling sometimes when you speak to politicians, whether it's in Edinburgh or in London or elsewhere and so on, that that when they pull the lever of government and so on, they pull the lever and it comes off in their hand. Nothing actually happens as a result of it, and that is something that you hear from Conservative politicians. It's something you hear from Labour politicians. If you look at Tony Blair, for instance, he now will say, I wish I'd gone further and harder and faster in my early years when I had the real opportunity to do so, but I didn't know enough about how government works. David Cameron would say something similar. How does that map onto your view and your experience in government? Because you've been in government for an awfully long time, and yet now you have to sort of reinvent yourself and your government.
Well, I think I think I've got quite a bit of sympathy with the point that when you come into government fresh, and we came in 2007, not one of us had any ministerial experience whatsoever. It is daunting, and we were aided by the fact that we had a document had been drafted before that election in 2007, which was the first 100 days of the SNP government, and we published it before the election. And it was a kind of condensed version of our manifesto. It sort of took the manifesto and said, well, if that's your objectives, what would you do in the first 100 days? And it kind of mapped that out. That proved to be one of the best things that was ever produced. It was written by one of my special advisors, Stephen Noon, back in the dark ages. That gave a tremendous...
When he was a teenager or something.
Well, he was a teenager there, but it gave a discipline to our activities in the first 100 days, so we had pace. And while we had pace, we were learning as we went along. I think that was one of the best things that we ever did, because it got us good momentum and it got us going as a government. Now, where I find myself now is, yes, I have been a minister for a long time, but crucially, and I'm sorry if I keep on coming back to this point, that year where I was out of the front line did me so much good. I was able to become rested physically and mentally. So physical and mental exhaustion when you're a government minister is not an unusual thing, because it's just relentless. So I came in rested, but I also came in with more experience of being in government than almost any other individual in Scottish society. And I hadn't forgotten all that. That all came in the door with me, but with a refreshed individual mentally and physically. So I've been able to apply all of those lessons to government. Now, I have a wee bit of sympathy with the kind of, you pull the lever and it comes off in your hand idea. But I don't have a lot of sympathy with that. There are things you can do. We've introduced a Scottish child payment. So we decided that we would do this. We would carve out the money to enable it to be funded. And our Social Security Agency has gone away and has delivered it, and delivered it successfully. And that's helping to keep thousands of children out of poverty. Now there's a really tangible example where you can turn rhetoric into reality and make a difference in people's lives. Now, one of the points that I would say, however, is that you've got to recognise how much bandwidth you've got available to you as a government. So if you use up, there's only a certain amount of bandwidth that any organisation can have available to it. And if you try to do too much across that bandwidth, don't be surprised if you don't do everything well, or you don't achieve everything. And that comes back to the question you asked me just a couple of minutes ago, but probably with the length of my answers, probably about half an hour ago. Which I think you're putting the fair point to me, Bernard, that people have to feel as if when the government says we're going to do this, that they actually feel it. Now I can give you examples. I've given you 4 examples there. Early learning childcare, Scottish Police Scotland, Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, Scottish Child Payment. They've gone from rhetoric to reality. But you would probably also be able to put to me things that haven't taken that journey. And I suppose I'm getting my retaliation in first. Well, I'm recognising you've got to focus your agenda to make an impact.
Sure, but I mean, let's go back to that answer you gave about the first 100 days, which was quite instructive. And I'm just thinking of an issue which is current, which is the setting of council tax, for example, where I think we're up to 15% in one authority and 7.5% is the lower end of what residents are going to have to pay in the next year. Now, you will remember that 2007 manifesto, we will scrap the unfair council tax. It was in every billboard, in every city centre. Now, we still have it.
Yeah.
And I listened on the car radio the other day to the finance secretary talking in sort of kumbaya terms about how we all should hold hands and try and find a way to deal with the manifest unfairness of the council tax. Now, I'm going to put to you a very, very simple point. Now, you may well have looked at local income tax, and you may well have decided that there were a whole load of logistical reasons why you don't go ahead with that. What is absolutely indisputable in terms of council tax, all the evidence is there, is that 60% of properties are in the wrong band. So there are unfairnesses, which you were supposed to scrap in 2007. There are unfairnesses now which can be done with one policy if there's the commitment, and that's just to revalue all the properties. Why won't you?
Well, I think that on the issues of the council tax, I think you've also got to inject something else into the equation, which is democracy. So we couldn't command a parliamentary majority to get rid of the council tax in 2007 to 2011. We had a manifesto in 2011 which did not include a commitment to abolish the council tax. We never put it in our manifesto because we'd been unable to get it through the Parliament.
But you could still have done it with a majority.
Well, we could have, but then I think you would have run into the democratic issues about the fact that we hadn't asked for a mandate to do that. And I'm simply saying that there is an interplay with what we say to the public about what the public have a reasonable expectation to deliver. Now, we've never gone into an election with a commitment to a revaluation, and I don't intend to do so. I think we've got to. You were a wee bit dismissive about just a wee bit dismissive about the kumbaya option, but there is.
We don't want to get disputatious in these kind of. It's
No,
not the tone of a podcast. I merely make the point that there is manifest unfairness in the system
absolutely.
now. There's absolutely nothing to stop the government, incidentally, irrespective of what's in the manifesto or what's not, taking a proposal to Parliament and letting Parliament decide.
Yeah, well, I think what I'm keen to do, and this is why I wasn't actually going to have a go at you about the kumbaya reference. I actually think your kumbaya reference is about politicians coming together and having a pretty honest discussion about what needs to be done here. Because I accept your point about manifest unfairness in the council tax. And I think what we've got to do more of, particularly in a parliament where the government doesn't have an overall majority today, where we've got to bring people together to come to solutions to difficult problems. Now, one of the things I'm optimistic about is that, and I'm really, I genuinely am overjoyed about where I find myself now. I did not think it would be possible for other parties to vote for the government's budget. I thought the political culture was so fractured in the Scottish Parliament when I became First Minister. I thought, at the best, we might get this through with somebody abstaining. And because we just don't have enough votes to get our own budget through. And we've worked really hard to try to reset the political culture of Parliament. And I actually think we've made headway in a lot of ways across all parties. But I'm particularly delighted that the Liberal Democrats and the Greens and ALPA have voted for the government's budget. I think it would have been perfectly possible. Indeed, I think it was a mistake for the Labour Party not to vote for our budget. I think it would have, I don't think it would have caused them any political. I actually think it would be a political upside for them. But hey ho, I'm not giving the Labour Party political advice. But I'm keen to create a political culture where we make a bit of headway on the difficult stuff, because we'll only make headway if we have rational, hard-headed conversations across the parties in Parliament.
Sure. I mean, you referred to the sort of fractious and very divisive state of the Parliament when you became First Minister after a year of, I think it's fair to say, turmoil under Humza Yousaf and obviously Nicola Sturgeon's prolonged period in office too. Now, if we accept that that's the case and that Scottish politics has been a very bitterly divided place for many years now, and that one of your goals is to try and have people working together in a more constructive fashion, and I think plenty of people would like the sound of that, would admire it in certain respects, responsibility for that fractured state presumably has to be shared across the Parliament, including the SNP.
Well, when I became First Minister, I accepted, in my acceptance speech on the 7th of May last year, I accepted my part in creating a more polarised Parliament. So the first stage to confronting these issues is to accept your own contribution towards it. And I accepted that openly in front of Parliament, in front of the country, and said, I intend to proceed differently. And that's what I'm doing. And I genuinely am thrilled that we got some more support for the budget than just, I used a comment the other day where I said, it was much preferable than the budget limping through on, the tide of abstention. That makes me feel as if we're making a bit of headway, and I hope we can continue to make headway on other issues.
So this is pork barrel politics as well, although in the case of votes from Orkney and Shetland, a couple of barrels of salted herring sent north and so on could purchase votes. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's politics, isn't it?
Not all the Liberal Democrat members represent Northern Ireland's constituencies. There are others, and I think it's a moment of encouragement that after, when. Immediately before my acceptance speech last May, Alec Cole-Hamilton, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, said that the votes of his party's members were available to bring down the government and force an early election. And then 9 months later, the Liberal Democrats were voting for the budget. Now, I don't say that to, make some cheap political point to them. I'm saying that to say I acknowledge that quite a distance was travelled between May and February, in which the Liberal Democrats have contributed to that, and I would say the Scottish National Party and my leadership of the government has contributed to that as well, in enabling, making it possible for people across the constitutional divide in Scotland to vote for some common priorities to take the country forward. And that's the style of leadership I want to bring to government.
You made a speech recently on the economy, economic outlook, and particularly with relation to the labour market in Scotland, the need for a visa system in order to have workers here that perhaps they don't want south of the border. Now, I know you're a busy man and you can't listen to our warblings, but we give that heartily the thumbs up, absolutely heartily the thumbs up. And I think the speech was actually rather important, and I'll tell you why. People that I know in business used to say of the first SNP administration, the one that was led by Alex Salmond, they would say, well, you don't necessarily always get what you want, but you do get the impression that at least you have the ear of government, that you can go and speak to government. And under Nicola Sturgeon's tenure, the very same people would say to me, they've completely and utterly taken their eye off the ball. There's very little access. She doesn't understand business. Now, any social democrat worth their salt understands that unless you create wealth, you don't have the spoils of wealth in order to make your policy priorities a reality. So first of all, let me ask you, was it the case that the SNP government at one point simply took its eye off the ball in terms of its relationship with Scottish business? And secondly, how do you plan to take this forward? Because just as Starmer's government will stand or fall by economic growth, your ability to deliver your social democratic ends, particularly in relation to public services, may well stand or fall by economic growth.
I don't think we took our eye off the ball in the economy, because I think the fundamental point that you make, and as a social democrat, I unreservedly accept it, that you have to have a vibrant economy to pay for the type of society you want to live in. So I don't think at any moment did that view change or think that somehow there was a way of avoiding that. But I do recognise that those sentiments were expressed, and if those sentiments were expressed, well, they were felt, so you've got to address them. I would venture to suggest today, and you'll be having these conversations, Bernard and Alex, with other people. I don't think that would be said today. Why is that not said today? Well, there's been a lot of engagement, principally led by my Deputy First Minister, Kate Forbes, who's done a superb job in engaging with the business community. She's the investment champion for the government. She's out there all the time identifying opportunities for investment, mechanisms for investment. This morning, I've just been down at a development in Granton in Edinburgh, and the government's putting in £16 million of enabling infrastructure work to open up a colossal site which has attracted private and public sector investment to build about 800 houses in the social housing and mid-market rent sector. £16 million of government investment. And that's the type of pragmatic intervention that I expect from an activist government that is out there looking to how do we open up possibilities for growth and economic opportunity. Now, Kate's doing so much of the heavy lifting on all of that, and is doing it very well. I get involved in all of that. You'll understand how important the economy and its stimulus is to me for all of my policy agenda. So I think we've got to be relentless about looking for those opportunities to make an impact on the economy, and that's the style of government that brought in. But I think we've changed a lot of those attitudes and perceptions, but you're only as good as your last attitude and perception.
Yeah, and that's sort of conceding the premise of Bernard's question there, I think. If again on the sort of economic and the shape and role of government, the Scottish Government's own figures, the JERS figures, report each year, and they suggest that public spending from both governments in Scotland amounts to around 50%, or actually a bit more than 50% of Scottish GDP. It's around 55% of onshore GDP. Now, I mention this not to say that it is too high or too low, but to ask you, to what extent can the state get larger in Scotland, given that it is already, in certain respects, spending at Central European levels, if you like?
It's got to be, well, the state's got to be sustainable. So we've got to take a set of decisions that enable us to live within the resources that are available to us. And we've done that every year that the SNP government has been in power, and we will do it again this year. We'll do it.
Well, that is a legal obligation. I mean,
well, it is, but it also doesn't happen automatically. You know, I had to do something in 2022. It would be, am I right? Yeah, 2022. I had to go to Parliament in September 2022 when I was standing in for Kate Forbes as Finance Secretary, and I had to reduce public expenditure by several £100 million to deal with the inflation spike that we were wrestling with. Now, you could say to me, well, that was your legal obligation to do so, and you would be correct. I would contend that wasn't easy. It was very, very uncomfortable to do it, but it had to be done. Now, that is about fiscal responsibility, and people would expect fiscal responsibility from their government. So we've got to take decisions that are sustainable. So therefore, that's why I attach such importance to growing the economy, because I need the economy to power on. I need the economy to grow so that we can have the resources generated that will enable us to invest in our public services. And that lies at the heart of the policy agenda that we take forward.
Politically, everything seems very, very fluid. On the morning after the general election, there were probably very few people within the SNP who were going to look at the prospect and say, we can win in 2026, because the cold chill of the decision of electors is always one that politicians simply cannot run away from. If you to say to Labour Party people now, looking at the polls, that it would all have unravelled, and they are just polls, it would have unravelled fairly quickly, they probably wouldn't have believed you. Now, my view is that things are very, very fluid. Elections are horses for courses. They're fought in discrete terms and grounds. And that I believe personally that 2026 will, in terms of the arithmetic, be the messiest of any parliament. But let me ask you, as you run into that, what's your own view of it? Because a lot does appear to be fluid, and we've got Reform UK, we've got ALAPA being quite bullish about their prospects. How do you look upon 2026? I
look upon it with optimism. I think I can win the 2026 election. I think we took an absolutely punishing defeat in July of last year. And I think that was essentially a product of two things. One was a desperate desire by Scottish voters to get rid of the Tory government, so they voted Labour as the quickest way to do that. And secondly, I think people felt disappointed in the SNP. And people drifted away from us, or some people stayed at home. And I can't do anything about the first sentiment, that people wanted to get rid of the Tory government and voted Labour to do that. I can do something about the second. And I've spent the best part of 9 months trying to rebuild the relationship between the Scottish National Party and the electorate in Scotland. Very significant amount of that has been based on making sure the government delivers for people. So the word delivery has been central to my whole approach. Secondly, the word trust has been central to my approach, that I've been essentially trying to just be straight with the public in Scotland about issues that are difficult and to address them, and to give the leadership where it's necessary to improve things. And then thirdly, the other word which is uppermost in my thinking is hope, about setting out to people that we actually can improve their lives in Scotland. Because I think part of what is driving the sentiment that has led to the change around that you're talking about since last summer of Labour Party leadership to a situation where we now have leadership in the polls, is that the Labour Party has essentially squandered the hopeful feeling that people had that things could get better, and they've actually not delivered on that. And the outlook for living standards over the course of this United Kingdom parliamentary term is not a hopeful outlook. So I've got to demonstrate to people hope, and I do that through the delivery of the government's programme about focusing on the issues that matter to people in Scotland, and that's been an absolute discipline of what I've been trying to do as First Minister, and then also about giving people hope about what the future of our country looks like.
Mm-hmm. But if there's a poll out this week conducted by Ipsos asking people across a whole range of policy areas and so on, do you think the Scottish Government is doing a good job or a bad job? And, on the NHS, on education, on the economy, on living standards, and across a whole range of issues and so on. Generally speaking, the percentage of voters who think the Scottish Government is doing a good job at the moment is between 20 and 30% on any given issue. It's a minority on all issues. So I suppose, are the voters wrong?
Well, the voters hold their opinion, and at the same moment as voters hold those opinions, if they are generally asked how would they vote in an election, more of them would say they were voting for the SNP than would be saying they think that a particular issue like health is in a good position. So the voters hold the views that they hold. My job is to make sure that they have more confidence in the Scottish National Party, and they can see the Scottish National Party delivering for them on the issues that matter to them. So if I take, for example, the health service, I've just literally, in coming to Butte House, I've just come from another of the sessions that I'm leading in relation to delivering the improvements in National Health Service performance that we are beginning to see. We're beginning to see more and more evidence of progress being delivered in the National Health Service. Just yesterday, the child and adolescent mental health targets were met by the Scottish Government. That's a big step forward for us. We've seen increases. Previous week, we saw increases in the number of procedures being undertaken within the National Health Service outlined. So we are steadily beginning to deliver those improvements. Now, how does that happen? It comes by the relentless commitment of members of staff, the length and breadth of the country, and it comes from the establishment of a very clear policy framework about what we're trying to achieve.
One of the things that the polls also point to is that it is possible, depending on how folk vote, that there might be, after 2026, a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. Now, if that's what the people vote for, that's what the people vote for. And the politicians should always be cognizant of what the people vote for. Now, I don't expect you to write your manifesto now, but clearly in circumstances where people vote for a Parliament which is committed to independence, it's back on the agenda.
That's right.
It's central stage because you cannot ignore what the people have done in an election. So without telling me what you're going to say, would you concede, nevertheless, that your manifesto in 2026 has to say something about independence?
No, of course it does, yes, of course, and it will. Of course it will. Because if we go back to the very first question you asked me at the very start of this whole discussion, you asked me about what had turned my head about politics. Why had I not looked at other things in life? And the idea that turned my head was the idea of Scottish self-government, of Scottish independence. So I want to make that happen. And the Scottish Parliament has been huge improvement and has delivered huge improvements in the lives of people in Scotland, but I think much more could be achieved with independence. I want us to progress to independence. So yes, of course that will form.
And a pro-independence majority would presumably lead to a demand for a second referendum.
Well, of course it would, yes.
even if that was delivered on 35% of the vote?
Well, I think these. Well, look, Alex, we've got a democratic system, and we've got a parliament that gets elected, and we should, these kind of democratic tests have all been there. But then ultimately, I've made no secret of the fact that I think the best way to resolve the question of independence is through a referendum on independence. And I think if people are so, the question you pose to me suggests some sense of reluctance or unease about the question. If people who are hostile to the idea of independence are so confident about the idea, let's just let it happen. Let's have the referendum on independence. Let the people decide what the future of the country should be.
But those people would then say, well, but then the SNP, if they'd lost a second referendum, they'd come back asking for a third and a fourth and a fifth if necessary.
Well, but if there's an appetite in Scotland to have a referendum, which I think there is, if there's an appetite in Scotland for Scotland to be an independent country, which I think is now more strongly represented than it was at the referendum in 2014, then let's test the opinion of the public. Let's hear what they've got to say.
Just on a point about marshalling support for independence. I mean, clearly the SNP are the main drivers of the case for Scottish independence because they're the largest political party. But there are people who belong to other political parties and indeed no political parties at all who actually believe in the case for Scottish independence and want to see Scottish independence happen. Now, let me suggest to you that one of the ways in which you can maximise the pressure on Westminster, who will no doubt say the same thing, now is not the time and all the rest of it. It is much more difficult for Westminster to say, now is not the time, if there is a clear understanding at a Holyrood election across all of the forces who believe in independence, that a vote for that party is a vote to pursue independence. And in that context, isn't it incumbent upon you as leading the major party of independence to talk to the Greens and talk to Alapa to try and come with a form of words that will maximise the vote for independence so that if there is a pro-independence parliament, no unionist politician at Westminster can simply dismiss it?
I think what's incumbent on me as leader of the Scottish National Party is to make sure the Scottish National Party, which has been the delivery vehicle of Scottish self-government, does as well as it possibly can do. And that's what my objective is.
Bring others into the tent.
Well,
Bring others into the tent.
I think the Labour Party would dispute that analysis as well, or that recounting of the historical record.
Well, I think that, they might debate it, but you're not going to try and persuade me. Like, I can remember, I've been around so long in this debate, I can remember how ambivalent the Labour Party was about Scottish self-government until the SNP won the Govan by-election in 1988, and then suddenly the Labour Party was galloping into a Scottish Constitutional Convention. So don't tell me that anything other than SNP votes has driven the debate on Scottish self-government, because the Labour Party would not have delivered it out of its munificence in Scotland. It's not got much record of doing that. But so my job is to mobilise and motivate support for the Scottish National Party and to be absolutely focused on doing so.
But not bringing others into the tent.
Well, I'm sure in the fullness of time we can all have discussions and conversations. But I want the SNP.
You've been all consensual in this podcast. Well, now you're going just a wee bit tribal.
Well, I've got an election moment where people have to make a choice in 2026, and they've got to make the right choice if they want Scotland to progress to independence.
But in the past, I remember Nicola Sturgeon. It was put to her that I quite like what you're doing in government, but I don't support independence and I don't want another referendum. What should I do? Nicola Sturgeon said, in certain respects perfectly reasonably, well, you should vote SNP. And then as soon as the election is done, that vote, which was explicitly not in favour of a referendum, is then sort of transformed into being a vote in favour of a referendum. And, people, do you not see that there is a trust issue there?
Well, I just think that we're explicit about the fact that we wants Scotland to become an independent country, and that the best way to resolve that question is for there to be a referendum on that question. And I think that's the simplest way of progressing on the argument.
And that could be progressed in 2026.
Easily.
Do you not think that the case for a second referendum on the same question has to be rather stronger than for the first time that question is asked?
How many ways are you trying to make it more difficult for Scotland to decide its own constitutional future, Alex?
But it already has decided it.
Well, but you know,
Hasn't
we
it?
live in a democracy, and people are entitled. You know, people are to change their minds every 5 years about who forms the government, and this is where I think the argument really needs to be confronted in the Westminster system. That Westminster is just folding its arms and saying we're just not engaging on this question, and I don't think that is democratically acceptable. We've got a parliamentary majority down the road in Holyrood which is in favour of Scotland being an independent country, and Westminster is just ignoring the wishes of the people of Scotland who have chosen that parliament, and I think that's unacceptable. We cannot allow that to carry on, and I want to make sure I make it my business to put the impetus into the argument to make sure that's not the case ever again.
Maybe one final question. You had your year out, you're refreshed. It brought some clarity in terms of how you approach the business of government. You've set out your 4 pillars. You will defend them at the election. I think it was the lady who did the Sermon on the Mount who said, "I will go on and on and on." Does the Church of Scotland man go on and on and on?
Well, I intend to stand in the 2026 election. I have every intention of winning that election, but that will be decided by the people, who I always respect. And if I have the good fortune to win that election and to be the First Minister, I will see out my 5-year term and stand for election in 2031.
There we have it, people. Ariston John goes on and on and on and on. I think that brings us pretty much to the end of our time here in Song First Minister. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk with us. Thank you to listeners and to those of you watching on YouTube as well. I hope that's been an instructive and illuminating discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed to the First Minister and his team for making so much time for us this afternoon. We've got over quite a lot of ground. Hope you've found it instructive. Hope you've enjoyed it. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.